In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, a story was scorched into the land, not with ink, but with tears and blood. It's a tale whispered from the saloons of dusty towns to the sacred fires of the Apache, a tale of a mother's impossible choice. What would you do if starvation had whittled you down to nothing but a ghost? Your infant son's cries, the only thing tethering you to this world. What bargain would you strike with a silent warrior who appeared from the heat haze, like a spectre of death itself? You think you know desperation. You haven't heard the story of Sarah Hemlock, because the deal she offered was just the beginning of a nightmare that would either destroy her or forge her into a legend. The sun was a merciless hammer and the land an anvil. Sarah Hemlock felt each blow as she stared out from the porch of her small, isolated homestead. The year was 1876, and the promise of the West, which had gleamed so brightly in her husband Thomas's eyes, had revealed itself to be nothing more than a cruel mirage. The land they had bought, the deed, signed and sealed in Tucson by a man named Harrison Payne, was supposed to have a year-round creek. It had dried to a cracked, muddy scar in the earth 3 months after they arrived. Thomas, ever the optimist, had dug a well. For a while, that was enough. They had their small field of corn, a few chickens, and their son Samuel, born during their first spring. He was a creature of hope, his small gurgles a sound of life in a land that seemed to specialize in silence and death. Then the fever came. It swept through the territory like a phantom fire, and it took Thomas in less than a week. Sarah was left with a 4-month-old infant, a failing well, and a horizon that offered no neighbors, no help, and no pity. Her nearest neighbor, if he could be called that, was Silas Croft. He owned the sprawling Seabar ranch that bordered her property to the east. Croft was a man carved from the same hard rock as the surrounding mesas, his eyes small and shrewd. He had visited once after Thomas's death, his condolences as thin as watered-down whiskey. "A woman alone has no business out here, Mrs. Hemlock," he'd said, stroking his thick, graying mustache. "This land chews up men. It'll swallow you whole." He had offered to buy her out, a pittance that was an insult to Thomas's memory and sweat. She refused. That was when her real troubles began. Her well water started tasting foul brackish. Then her last 2 chickens were found dead, their necks snapped. A week later she found the well itself had been deliberately foul dirt and animal dung thrown into its depths. She had no proof it was Silas Croft, but she knew. He was waiting for her to break, to crawl to him, and accept his miserable offer. But Sarah Hemlock was made of sterner stuff than Silas Croft wagered. She had her husband's rifle, a dwindling supply of flour, and her son. The flour was the most pressing problem. Samuel was too young for hardtack, and her own body, starved and stressed, was failing to produce enough milk. His cries were becoming weaker, his small body lighter in her arms each day. She had to get to the settlement of Redemption Gulch. It was a brutal 2-day walk, but a man named Franklin Pierce, a friendly freight driver, was supposed to pass by on the southern trail at the end of the week. He could take her and Samuel to town. She packed what little she had, a waterskin, the rifle, a handful of flour mixed with water to make a thin, pitiful gruel, and her baby. She never made it to the trail. The heat was a physical entity, a predator that stalked her through the sagebrush and mesquite. By the second day, her water was gone. Her vision swam the landscape, warping into a hellish dream. Samuel's cries were now thin, reedy whimpers that tore at her soul. She stumbled, fell, and lay in the meager shade of a Palo Verde tree, the world dissolving into a shimmering haze. She was dying. Worse, her son was dying in her arms. She had failed. Failed Thomas. Failed Samuel. She pulled the last of her provisions from her satchel. a small, hard lump of bread made from the last of the flour and baked over a small fire the night before. It was all she had left in the world. She looked at its coarse texture, then at the face of her son. His eyes closed, his breathing shallow. The bread could keep her alive for another few hours, maybe. But what was the point? If he was gone, it was then in the depths of her delirium that she saw him. He was a mirage. At first, a tall figure, shimmering in the heat. As he drew closer, he resolved into a man. He was Apache, that much was clear from his buckskin clothing, the set of his jaw and the long dark hair, held back by a simple band. He moved with a liquid grace that made the brutal landscape seem like his natural garden. He carried a bow and a rifle, and on his hip hung a canteen and a pouch from which the scent of dried meat and baked bread faintly emanated. He stopped a dozen paces from her, his face a mask of stoic neutrality. His eyes, dark and deep, took in the scene without a flicker of emotion, the half-dead woman, the fading infant, the utter desolation. He was not a savior. He felt like a vulture waiting for the inevitable. Desperation, raw and primal, clawed its way up Sarah's throat. Reason had fled. All that was left was a mother's instinct, twisted by starvation and grief into something monstrous. The warrior's name was Nantan Lupan, though Sarah Hemlock would not know this for a long time. To her, in that moment of sun-bleached madness, he was simply the man with bread. His presence was absolute, a silent monolith against the screaming emptiness of the desert. He watched her, his gaze not cruel, but unnervingly patient, as if he were a feature of the landscape, as ancient and unreadable as the rocks themselves. Sarah's mind, fractured by heat and despair, saw only one path. It was a grotesque, insane path, but it was the only one left. Her own life was forfeit. She knew it in the rattling of her own breath, in the leaden weight of her limbs. But Samuel was a spark, a tiny flickering ember that could still be fanned into a flame. She watched the warrior's hand rest near the pouch on his hip. She could smell it. Bread. Real bread. And jerky. Life. Please, she croaked, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. Nantan Lupan did not move. His silence was more profound than any shout. It absorbed her plea, leaving nothing in its wake. "My son," she whispered, looking down at the still form in her arms. Samuel's chest barely moved. His skin was pale, his lips tinged with blue. He's starving." The Apache's eyes shifted from her face to the baby, then back. There was no pity, no judgment, only observation. He was a force of nature, and she was a dry weed in his path. This impassive wall broke something inside Sarah. The last vestiges of her civilized self, of the woman who had once discussed literature and planned a garden, crumbled into dust. She was an animal, now caught in a trap, willing to chew off her own leg or her own heart to save her young. With trembling hands, she unwrapped the small hard biscuit she had saved, her last provision. It was a pathetic offering. She held it out. "I have this." She rasped the words, tearing at her raw throat. "It's not much." He looked at the pitiful piece of bread, and then at her, his expression unchanged. It was clear her offer was meaningless. What was this crumb to a man who lived and breathed this land? Her mind screamed. She had nothing else. No money, no jewels, no trade. Nothing but the small, warm weight in her lap. The thought that came next was born of pure horror, a blasphemy that she would have once believed would damn her soul for eternity. But her soul was already damned. It had been damned the moment her milk dried up. "Wait," she called out, her voice cracking with a terrifying new strength. She gathered all her remaining energy. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, the movement sending black spots dancing in her vision. She held her son Samuel out towards the warrior. The offering hung in the dead, silent air. The baby, her own flesh and blood, the last piece of Thomas in the world, the center of her universe. Trade, she begged the word, a shard of glass in her mouth. Bread for the boy. The silence that followed was a physical weight. The buzzing of insects ceased. The wind held its breath. The sun seemed to hang motionless in the sky. Nantan Lupan's gaze finally fully settled on her. For the first time, an emotion flickered in those dark eyes. It was not pity, nor was it avarice. It was something deeper, something ancient and unreadable. He looked at the baby limp in her outstretched arms, then at her face, a mask of desperate, insane conviction. He said nothing. Not a word. Not a grunt. He took a step forward. Then another. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a panther. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. He was accepting. The monster inside her shrieked in triumph while the mother wept in agony. He reached her. He did not look at Samuel. Instead, his long, calloused fingers reached out and took the small, hard biscuit from her hand. For a terrifying second, she thought he would just take it and leave. But he didn't. His other hand went to the pouch at his hip. He pulled out a piece of flat bread, thick, soft, and rich with the smell of life, and a strip of dried venison. He placed them on the ground beside her, within her reach. Relief, dizzying and nauseating, washed over Sarah. He had accepted. The trade was made. She had sold her son for a piece of bread. She closed her eyes, unable to watch, ready for him to take the child and walk away, to leave her to her solitary doom. She heard a rustle. She felt a shadow fall over her. This was it. She opened her eyes. Nantan Lupan was not walking away. He was standing over her. His hand, the one that had taken her pathetic biscuit, was reaching down. But it wasn't for the bread she had just bought with her soul. With a gentleness that was utterly at odds with his formidable presence, he reached past the bread and jerky. His hand closed around her arm, his grip firm but not painful. He began to pull her to her feet. No, she mumbled, confused. The trade. And then his other hand moved. In one smooth, impossibly swift motion, he leaned down and scooped the baby Samuel from her lap. He cradled the infant against his broad chest, holding him with a practiced ease that sent a fresh wave of shock through Sarah. He had the bread he'd brought. He now had her son. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to pierce right through her. Then, with her son in one arm, he turned and began to walk away into the shimmering heat from which he had emerged. He had taken both, the bread and the baby. He had left her with nothing but the food she had just purchased, and a silence that screamed louder than any sound she had ever heard. Sarah Hemlock fell back against the earth, the venison and bread lying untouched beside her, and for the first time in her life, she welcomed the encroaching darkness. It was Franklin Pierce, the freight driver, who found her. He'd taken a detour to check on the Hemlock place, a nagging worry in his gut about the widow and her child. He found Sarah 1/2 mile from her homestead, unconscious, her face blistered by the sun, the piece of untouched flatbread lying on her chest like a funeral offering. There was no sign of the baby. He got her to Redemption Gulch, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings clinging to the side of a dry creek bed. The town doctor, a weary, whiskey-scented man named Alistair Finch, clicked his tongue and set to work. He poured water between her cracked lips, tended to her burns, and muttered about the foolishness of trying to tame a land that wanted no taming. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. In her fever dreams, she saw the Apache warrior's face, his eyes holding the secrets of the stones and the sky. She saw her son, Samuel, carried away into the blinding sun. Each time she surfaced to lucidity, the memory would hit her with the force of a physical blow, and she would scream, a raw animal sound that unnerved the patrons of the saloon across the street. When she was finally able to speak, Dr. Finch and Sheriff Brody were at her bedside. Brody was a stolid man, his face a road map of sun wrinkles, his demeanor one of perpetual low-grade skepticism. "Mrs. Hemlock," the sheriff began, his voice flat. "Frank Pierce found you. Your boy. Samuel, he wasn't with you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "He took him," she whispered, her voice a hoarse rasp. "An Apache warrior." Dr. Finch and Sheriff Brody exchanged a look. It was a look Sarah would come to know well, a mixture of pity and disbelief. "An Apache," Brody repeated. What was he doing so far south, alone? Most of Chiricahua are up in the dragoons. "I don't know," Sarah insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "He just appeared. I was starving. The baby." Her voice broke. She couldn't bring herself to confess the terrible bargain she had offered. How could she? They already thought she was mad. The truth would only condemn her. "He had food. He took my son. He just took him." "Did he harm you, Mom?" the sheriff asked. Sarah hesitated. "No. He left me food." Another look passed between the two men. This one was even more telling. An Apache kidnaps a white baby, but leaves the mother unharmed and gives her provisions. The story strained credulity to its breaking point. "Mom," Dr. Finch said gently, patting her hand, "you've been through a terrible ordeal. The heat, the lack of water. It can play tricks on the mind. It makes people see things, do things they can't explain." Sarah pulled her hand away. "I am not crazy. I know what I saw." The official search lasted 2 days. Sheriff Brody and a few deputized townsmen rode out to her homestead. They found the fouled, well-confirming part of her story. They found her tracks leading out into the desert. But they found no other tracks. No sign of a lone Apache warrior. The hard, sun-baked ground held few secrets, and the ones it held it did not give up easily. To a man like Brody, an Apache moving through that terrain would leave no more trace than a hawk's shadow. The conclusion in town was unspoken, but universal. Sarah Hemlock, mad with grief and starvation, had lost her child to the wilderness. They imagined the baby succumbing to the heat, Sarah in her delirium, burying him in a shallow, unmarked grave, her mind creating the story of the Apache warrior to shield herself from the unbearable truth. Her status in Redemption Gulch shifted overnight. She was no longer the tragic widow. She was the madwoman, the object of pity and suspicion. The women of the town who had once offered condolences now crossed the street to avoid her. Their whispers followed her like flies. Silas Croft arrived in town a week later, his face a perfect mask of concern. He found Sarah sitting on the porch of the boarding house where Dr. Finch had arranged for her to stay. "Mrs. Hemlock," he said, removing his hat. "I just heard the terrible news. My deepest, most sincere sympathies." Sarah looked at him, her eyes cold. "Did you foul my well, Mr.?" Croft's feigned sympathy evaporated, replaced by a flash of anger. "That is a vile accusation. I came here to offer my help, and this is the thanks I get." He straightened up his voice, taking on a tone of righteous indignation. "Frankly, Ma'am, the whole town is talking. They say you were out of your head, that perhaps this tragedy was a result of your own instability." He was turning her own story, her own trauma against her. He was using the town's suspicion as a weapon. "You won't get my land." "Silas," she said, her voice low and trembling with a rage that surprised even herself. "Your land," he scoffed. "That worthless patch of dust is the least of my concerns. But since you bring it up, Harrison Payne, the land agent in Tucson, is a friend of mine. He mentioned the homesteading contract has a productive use clause. A property left abandoned for more than a month reverts back. You're here. The property is there. It's a simple matter of paperwork. He had planned this all along. The fouled well, the isolation, it was all designed to drive her off the land, one way or another. Her tragic story was just a convenient final nail in the coffin of her life as a homesteader." That night, Sarah lay awake, the whispers of the town echoing in her ears. They thought she was weak. They thought she was mad. They thought she was broken. Let them. Their disbelief forged a new kind of strength in her, a hard, sharp resolve. She didn't need their help. She didn't need their pity. They had all taken something from her. Silas Croft was trying to take her home. The town had taken her reputation, but the Apache warrior, he had taken her son. She didn't know his name or where he had gone, but she had his face burned into her memory. She would find him. If she had to walk into the heart of the Apache itself, she would find him. And she would get her son back. The world had counted her out. They were about to learn how badly they had miscalculated. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet perseverance. Sarah took a job mending clothes for the boarding house owner, a stern but fair woman named Martha, earning enough to keep a roof over her head. She ate, forcing down the tasteless food, rebuilding her strength. She spoke little, offering polite nods to the townspeople who stared and whispered. They saw a broken woman quietly accepting her fate. They did not see the fire being stoked within her. Every spare moment was spent in the town's small, dusty mercantile, run by a man named Elias Rowe. She wasn't there to shop. She was there to listen. She listened to the prospectors, the trappers, the freight drivers, anyone who spoke of the lands outside, the suffocating confines of Redemption Gulch. She learned the names of mountains and canyons, the Dragoons, the Chiricahuas, Skeleton Canyon, Apache Pass. These were no longer just names on a map. They were potential hiding places. She learned about the Apache. The townsfolk spoke of them as a monolithic demonic force, attributing every missing cow or unexplained death to them. But the men who had actually traveled the territory spoke differently. They spoke of different bands, different leaders. They spoke of Cochise, now dead, who had been a legend. They spoke of Geronimo, whose name was a curse on their lips. And a few, the older trappers who remembered a time before the bitter wars, spoke of others. One evening, an old prospector named Jebediah, his face a leathery mask and his voice thick with whiskey, was telling a story. And there we were, pinned down in the rocks, he slurred, and I swear it was the grey wolf himself on the ridge above us. Nantan Lupan, they call him. Not like Geronimo's band, always looking for a fight. He just watches. They say he can see a puff of dust 20 miles away, never attacks unless provoked. But if you provoke him, well, you don't come back to tell the tale. Sarah's breath caught in her chest. Nantan Lupan, Grey Wolf. The name felt right. It fit the silent, watchful presence of the man who haunted her dreams. She approached Jebediah after he had stumbled out of the saloon. This warrior, she began, her voice steady. Nantan Lupan. What do you know of him? Jebediah squinted at her. Why's a lady like you asking about him? He ain't the friendly type. I heard he sometimes travels alone, Sarah pressed, ignoring his question. South of the Dragoons. The old prospector scratched his beard. Could be. His people move with the seasons. but I ain't seen him this far south in a coon's age. Not since the sickness." "The sickness?" "Yeah," Jebediah said, his voice lowering. "Swept through his camp a season or two back. The coughing sickness brought by some soldiers from Fort Bowie, they say. Took a lot of 'em. Took his wife, I heard, and his newborn child." The world tilted on its axis. Sarah steadied herself against a post, the prospector's words echoing in her mind. His wife. His newborn child. A piece of the puzzle, sharp and painful, slid into place. It didn't excuse what he did, but it changed the shape of it. This wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was something else. Something she couldn't yet comprehend. Her resolve hardened. She needed more than just a name. She needed a guide. She needed a way in. Her quest for information led her to the livery, where she began asking questions of the Mexican freighters and the few local natives who were tolerated at the edge of town. She was looking for a track, a sign, anything. She described the warrior, tall, a specific type of beaded band on his rifle, a small distinctive scar above his left eye she had noticed in that final terrible moment. Most shrugged and turned away, unwilling to speak of the Apache to a white woman. But one man, a quiet farrier named Mateo, listened intently. "The man you describe," he said in a low voice, looking around nervously. "He sounds like a man I know. Not Apache, but he lives between their world and ours. He is called Chaco. Where can I find him?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. "You don't find him. He finds you if he wishes it," Mateo said. "He sometimes trades hides with Elias Rowe at the mercantile. But be warned, Senora. He trusts no one, especially not your kind." For a week, Sarah haunted the mercantile waiting. Finally, she saw him. He was not what she expected. He was wiry and of indeterminate age, his face weathered, but his eyes sharp and intelligent. He was of mixed blood, that much was clear, and he carried himself with a guarded stillness. She approached him as he was tying a bundle of furs to his mule. "They call you Chaco," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. He didn't turn around. "They call me many things. I need a guide. I need to find the camp of Nantan Lupan." He stopped his work and slowly turned to face her. He looked her up and down, his gaze missing nothing. "The Apache do not welcome visitors. They would kill me for bringing you and kill you for being there." "I'm not a visitor," Sarah said, meeting his gaze. "I'm a mother. He has my son." A flicker of something surprise interest crossed Chaco's face. He had heard the town's gossip, of course. He had heard about the crazy woman whose baby had died in the desert. "The town says you are mad," he stated simply. "The town didn't see what I saw," she retorted. "I will pay you." She held out the small pouch of coins she had painstakingly saved. He glanced at the pouch and then back at her face. He seemed to look right through her, weighing her story, her sanity, her soul. "Your money is worthless where we are going," he said. He turned back to his mule. Sarah's heart sank. This was her last hope. "Please," she said, her voice losing its edge of command. "He is all I have left." Chaco finished tying the knot on his pack. He stood for a long moment, his back to her, staring out at the distant purple mountains. The very mountains she needed to cross. "Meet me at the Twin Rock Formation, south of town at sunrise," he said, without turning around. "Bring water for 3 days, a rifle you know how to use, and no illusions. I am not taking you to get your son back. I am taking you to the place where you will either find him or your grave. The outcome is the same to me." He then mounted his mule and rode out of town without a backward glance, leaving Sarah standing in the dust, a terrifying, exhilarating sliver of hope shining in the darkness of her despair. The pre-dawn air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of dust and creosote. Sarah stood by the twin rocks, a pair of sandstone sentinels that marked the edge of Redemption, Gulch's small sphere of influence. Beyond them lay the Apache, a land governed not by sheriffs and laws, but by sunstone and survival. She had Thomas's Winchester rifle slung over her shoulder, a full canteen, and a small sack with dried meat and hardtack. She had traded her last few coins and the locket with her parents' pictures inside for them. The past was a luxury she could no longer afford. Chaco appeared as the first rays of sun bled across the horizon, not riding but walking beside his mule, a ghost materializing from the gloom. He gave her a critical look, his eyes lingering on her sturdy boots and practical clothing. He nodded once, a curt, almost imperceptible gesture of approval. The first lesson, he said, his voice low and raspy. Out here you do not talk unless you have to. Sound travels. It brings trouble. You listen, you watch, you walk, and they walked. Chaco set a relentless pace, not fast, but steady, eating up the miles, with an economy of motion that Sarah struggled to emulate. The landscape shifted from scrubland to rocky foothills, the ground a treacherous maze of thorny bushes and loose shale. Within hours, Sarah's town-softened body was screaming in protest. Her muscles ached, her lungs burned, and the rifle strap dug a raw trench into her shoulder. Chaco never looked back. He seemed to know her limits better than she did, stopping for brief rests in the shade of a rock outcropping or by a hidden seep of water she never would have found on her own. During these stops, he spoke not in conversation, but in lessons. He showed her how to read the land, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of pebbles. The flight pattern of a bird to him. They were words in a language she was just beginning to learn. He taught her that an Apache warrior could walk across a rock field and leave no more sign than the wind. Nantan Lupan is not a man. Chaco told her one evening, as they huddled by a smokeless fire, a small pit of embers that gave off heat, but no light. He is a part of this land. When he was a boy, the Mexican soldiers killed his father. When he was a man, your soldiers killed his mentor. Then the sickness the White Eyes brought took his wife and child. He does not hate you. You are simply the storm that brought the flood. To him you are weather, impersonal, destructive. But he took my son, Sarah, insisted her voice a fierce whisper. That was not impersonal. That was a choice. Everything is a choice. Chaco agreed, his eyes reflecting the faint starlight. But you do not yet understand why he made it. Days bled into one another. Sarah grew leaner, harder. The sun browned her skin and calluses formed on her hands and feet. The city dweller's mind, filled with worries about reputation and propriety, fell silent, replaced by a primal focus, water, food, shelter, the trail. She learned to move quietly, to listen to the whisper of the wind, to feel the earth beneath her feet. She was shedding her old self layer by layer like a snake sheds its skin. One afternoon, disaster struck. As they were navigating a narrow canyon, the unmistakable dry rattle echoed from a ledge above them. Sarah froze, her blood turning to ice. A large, diamond-back rattlesnake lay coiled in the sun, its head raised, its tongue flicking. Chaco slowly pushed her behind him. "Do not move," he breathed, but his mule, spooked by the sound, shied violently. It bucked its pack of supplies, tearing loose and tumbling down the rocky slope. The waterskins, their most precious cargo, burst upon the sharp rocks. Their water supply for the next 2 days was gone, a dark, spreading stain on the thirsty ground. The snake, disturbed by the commotion, slithered back into the crevices. But the damage was done. We are 2 days from the next reliable spring. Chaco said, his face grim as he surveyed the loss. "We cannot go on. We must go back." "No," Sarah said, the word like iron in her mouth. "I am not going back." Chaco looked at her, his expression a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You will die of thirst in a day. Your son will be an orphan for good. Do not be a fool. There has to be another way," she insisted, her eyes scanning the canyon walls. Her mind, now honed by Chaco's lessons, was not panicking. It was searching. She remembered him pointing out a type of cactus days earlier, its flesh holding moisture. She remembered him speaking of how certain rock formations can sometimes trap rainwater. "That way," she said, pointing up a steep, treacherous-looking ravine. "The rock looks different, darker, and there are plants growing in the crevices that aren't growing down here. There might be water trapped up there." Chaco stared at the ravine, then back at her. For the first time, he looked at her, not as a liability, but as a peer. He saw the desperation in her eyes, but also the sharp, focused intelligence of a survivor. "It is a dangerous climb," he warned. "If you fall, I will leave you. I won't fall," Sarah said. The climb was grueling, a vertical struggle against loose rock and sharp edges. Her fingers bled, her muscles screamed, but she kept going, driven by the image of Samuel's face. Near the top she found it, a small shaded basin in the rock, a natural cistern holding a precious few gallons of stagnant but life-giving water. As they refilled their remaining canteen, Chaco looked at her, a new respect in his eyes. "Perhaps you will not die out here, after all, Sarah Hemlock," he said, using her name for the first time. The incident marked a turning point. She was no longer just his passenger. She was his partner in this desperate journey. She had proven she had more than just stubbornness. She had Taza, the Apache word Chaco had taught her, for strength and endurance. A few days later, as they crested a high mesa, Chaco froze. He pointed to the valley below. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke curled up into the vast blue sky. It was not a traveler's fire. It was the careful, deliberate smoke of a hidden camp. "They are there," Chaco whispered, his voice tense. "Nantan Lupan's people." Sarah stared down at the smoke, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. Months of pain, of doubt, of struggle had led her to this moment. Her son was down there. She gripped the Winchester, her knuckles white. The woman who had left Redemption Gulch would have charged down into the valley demanding justice. But the woman who stood on the mesa now was different. She was harder, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous. She knew this was not the end of her journey. It was the beginning of the final, most perilous test. The camp was nestled in a small, hidden valley, protected by sheer rock walls on 3 sides, and a narrow, easily guarded entrance. It was a place chosen for survival, not comfort. They spent the rest of the day observing from the high ridge concealed behind a jumble of ancient boulders. Sarah's eyes devoured the scene below. It was a small community. Women moved about their tasks, tanning hides or grinding corn, their conversations a low musical murmur that drifted up on the wind. Children played in the dust, their laughter sharp and clear in the quiet air. It was a scene of domestic peace that stood in stark contrast to the violent reputation the Apache held in Redemption Gulch. She searched for him. She scanned every face, every movement, but Samuel was nowhere to be seen. A cold dread began to seep into her bones. What if Jebediah the prospector was wrong? What if the baby had died, after all, and the warrior had simply left his body to the elements? Chaco seemed to read her mind. "Patience," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the camp. "An Apache child is the child of the people. He will be with one of the women." As dusk began to paint the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple, the warriors returned. They appeared out of the wilderness in small groups, as silent as the setting sun, their hunt successful. And among them was him, Nantan Lupan. He was just as she remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that commanded attention without a single word. He carried himself with a weary dignity. He handed the deer he carried to one of the women, and then walked to a small wickiup set slightly apart from the others. He disappeared inside and did not re-emerge. "That is his dwelling," Chaco breathed. "He lives alone now." Sarah's hand tightened on her rifle. "We go tonight." "No," Chaco countered firmly. "To go in there at night is to die. They have dogs and sentries you will never see. You will wait. I will go. I will speak with him. He won't listen to you. He's a killer, a kidnapper. He is a leader of his people." Chaco corrected her, his voice sharp. "He is a man who has lost everything. There is a protocol to these things, a way it must be done. You will show respect, or you will lose your son and your life. At dawn we will approach, unarmed. Unarmed." The idea was terrifying. Her rifle had become an extension of her own arm, her one tangible piece of power in this unforgiving land. To approach a camp with a weapon is an act of aggression. To approach without one is a request for parley. It is their way. He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "You have come this far, Sarah Hemlock. You have learned to survive the desert. Now you must learn to survive men. Trust me in this." She fought the instinct to argue, to take control. But Chaco had not led her wrong yet. She owed him her life several times over. With a reluctant nod, she agreed. The night was the longest of Sarah's life. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every cry of a distant coyote sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She clutched the rifle to her chest, a useless comfort. She was placing her entire world, the life of her son, on the word of a man she barely knew, and the hope that a warrior who had stolen her child possessed a code of honor. As the first hint of grey lightened the eastern sky, Chaco roused her. "It is time." She cached the Winchester beneath a pile of rocks, the act feeling like burying a part of herself. Her hands felt naked, vulnerable. Following Chaco's lead, they made their way down the steep path into the valley. They walked slowly, openly, making no attempt to conceal themselves. They were halfway to the camp when a voice, sharp and guttural, challenged them from the rocks above. An Apache warrior, his face painted with black stripes, stood poised with a nocked arrow, aimed directly at Chaco's chest. Chaco stopped and raised an open hand palm forward. He called out in the Apache language, his tone respectful and calm. The warrior did not lower his bow, but he listened. After a tense exchange, the warrior gave a curt nod and gestured for them to proceed. As they walked into the camp, the world seemed to stop. The women paused their work, their dark eyes watching Sarah with a mixture of curiosity and hostility. The children fell silent and hid behind their mothers' skirts. The air was thick with unspoken tension. They were the first white people to set foot in this camp in a very long time, and Sarah was a white woman, the very picture of the people who had brought them so much pain. Nantan Lupan emerged from his wickiup. He held no weapon, but he needed none. His presence alone was an impenetrable shield. His eyes found Sarah's, and for the first time, she saw them not as the cold, emotionless eyes of a predator, but as the weary, ancient eyes of a man burdened by immense grief. He remembered her. There was no doubt. He looked at Chaco, a question in his gaze. Chaco spoke again in the Apache tongue, his voice carrying across the silent camp. He spoke for a long time, gesturing to Sarah, then toward the direction from which they had come. Sarah could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. He was not making demands. He was telling her story. He was telling of her journey, her strength, her refusal to give up. He was telling of a mother's quest. When Chaco finished, a profound silence settled over the camp. Every eye was on Nantan Lupan, waiting for his judgment. The grey wolf looked at Sarah. He studied her face, her tattered clothes, the calluses on her hands, the fierce, unwavering fire in her eyes. He saw not the pathetic half-dead creature he had left in the desert, but a woman who had been reforged in the furnace of the wilderness. He spoke his voice, a low rumble, the first words she had ever heard him utter. He spoke in his own language, but his gaze was locked on hers. Then he turned and gestured to a woman who was standing near the back of the crowd, holding a cradleboard. The woman stepped forward. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. Her heart stopped. The woman turned the cradleboard, and Sarah looked into the face of her son. Samuel was not just alive, he was healthy. His cheeks were chubby, his skin was clear, and he was sleeping peacefully, his small mouth working in a silent suckle. He was thriving. Tears streamed down Sarah's face, silent hot trails of relief and joy and confusion. She took a step forward, her arms outstretched, but Nantan Lupan raised a hand, stopping her. The final test was not yet over. The sight of her son, healthy and whole, shattered the armor of rage and vengeance Sarah had worn for months. All that remained was the raw, overwhelming love of a mother. Yet Nantan Lupan's raised hand held her in place, a silent command that was impossible to disobey. The entire camp watched their faces, unreadable masks. Nantan Lupan spoke again. This time his words were directed at her, but Chaco translated his voice, low and soft, beside her. He says Chaco began that, when he found you, he did not see a woman. He saw a ghost. He saw that the spirit had already left your body, and that you were waiting for the earth to claim you. The warrior's eyes were fixed on hers, and as he spoke, she was transported back to that blindingly hot patch of dirt, the taste of dust and defeat in her mouth. He says the baby's cries were as weak as a kitten's. Chaco continued. He knew you had no milk. He knew you had no strength to get him to safety. To leave the child with you would have been to leave him in an open grave. Sarah shook her head, the tears blurring her vision. The trade. I offered him a trade. Chaco relayed her words. Nantan Lupan listened, and a flicker of something, not pity, but a deep, shared sorrow crossed his face. He says there was no trade, Chaco translated. A mother's heart is not a thing to be bartered. He says he saw your delirium. He saw your sacrifice, and he would not allow it. Nantan Lupan then gestured to the woman holding Samuel. The woman's name was Ishkainai, and she stepped forward, her eyes soft, with a sorrow that mirrored the warrior's. Chaco's voice dropped to a near whisper as he explained. This woman is the sister of Nantan Lupan's wife. His wife, Chiwadin, gave birth to a son 2 days before he found you. But the baby, his spirit was not strong. He did not take a breath. Chiwadin's heart broke, and her own spirit followed her son's 2 days later. It was the same day he found you on the trail. The truth landed on Sarah with the force of a physical blow. She looked at Ishkainai, and for the first time noticed the signs of recent grief in her eyes, the way she held the cradleboard with both a practiced ease and a profound reverence. When he found you, Chaco said, his voice thick with emotion, he saw a dying baby, and he knew of a woman with a mother's milk, and no child to give it to. He took your son not to steal him, but to save him. He left you the bread and jerky, so that you too might live. It was all so terribly, horribly simple. His actions, which had seemed like the height of cruelty, were in fact an act of profound, if harsh, mercy. He had not taken from her. He had taken for both of them. He had taken her son to the only place in that vast, empty wilderness where there was life for him. He had taken both to save both. He says Chaco concluded that he saw in your eyes the same fire that was in his wife's, the fire of a mother. He gambled that this fire would not be extinguished. He believed that if you survived, you would one day come for your son. He was testing you, to see if you were worthy of raising a child in this hard land. He paused, looking from the stoic warrior to Sarah's tear-streaked face. You have passed his test. With a nod from Nantan, Lupan Ishkaine walked the final few steps and gently, reverently passed the cradleboard into Sarah's trembling arms. The moment Samuel was in her arms, the world righted itself. He stirred his eyes, fluttering open. He looked up at her, a moment of confusion in his infant gaze, before a small, drowsy smile touched his lips. He knew her. On some primal level, he knew her. Sarah buried her face in his warm blanket, her sobs no longer of grief or rage, but of a relief so profound, it felt like a rebirth. She looked up at Nantan Lupan, the warrior who had been her demon, her tormentor, and now her reluctant savior. Thank you. She whispered the two simple words carrying the weight of her entire journey. He gave a slow, solemn nod. He had not returned her son. He had, in his own way, been keeping him safe for her. The tension in the camp broke. The other women who had watched with suspicion now approached their faces, softened. They cooed over Samuel, touching his cheek gently. They offered Sarah water and food. In their eyes, she was no longer an intruder. She was a mother, a title they understood and revered above all others. She had proven her strength. She was one of them. But as the sun reached its zenith, casting short, sharp shadows across the valley floor, the peace was shattered. A single rifle shot cracked through the air, the bullet whining off a rock near the camp's entrance. The sentry who had first challenged them fell from his post, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Panic erupted. Women screamed and grabbed their children, pulling them into the safety of the wickiups. The warriors, including Nantan Lupan, grabbed their rifles, their faces instantly transforming from weary peace to the hard masks of battle. Chaco grabbed Sarah, pulling her and the baby behind a large boulder. "What is it? Who is it?" she cried. Chaco peered cautiously around the rock. On the ridge overlooking the camp's entrance stood 3 men. One of them was Silas Croft. The other 2, holding smoking rifles, were clearly hired guns, their faces hard and cruel. Croft had not been content to simply steal her land through legal paperwork. Worried that she might somehow return, that her wild story might be proven true, he had tracked her. He had followed Chaco, waiting for his moment. He had not come to bring her back. He had come to erase the final inconvenient witness to his crimes. And in his greedy, arrogant mind, slaughtering an Apache camp to cover his tracks was simply the cost of doing business. "He will kill us all." Chaco breathed, his face grim. The Apaches were outnumbered and outpositioned, caught in their own sanctuary. Sarah looked down at the son she had just gotten back, his peaceful sleep shattered by the violence of her world bleeding into his. A new kind of fire ignited within her, not the slow burn of resolve, but the white-hot inferno of a mother protecting her child. She had not come this far, endured so much, only to lose him again to the petty greed of a man like Silas Croft. "No," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. She looked at Chaco. "Where did I hide my rifle? In that valley of decision, Sarah Hemlock was no longer a victim. She was a warrior, forged by the desert and anointed by a mother's fierce love. With her son safely in Ishkaine's care, she retrieved her Winchester and fought alongside the very people she once considered her enemies. Her knowledge of Croft, combined with the Apache's skill, turned the tide of the bloody battle. It was Sarah's bullet, fired with a steady hand and a righteous heart, that ultimately found its mark, ending Silas Croft's reign of greed forever. In the aftermath, she was given a choice by Nantan Lupin: return to her world or stay. She chose to stay for a time to let her son grow strong under the watchful eyes of the people who had saved him. Her story became a quiet legend, a testament to the fact that the most savage frontiers are not on any map, but are found within the desperate, unbreakable heart of a mother. Thank you for listening to this tale from the forgotten pages of the Old West. If this story of survival courage and unexpected truth moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share it with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales that bring history to life. Your support allows us to keep searching for these incredible stories and sharing them with the world. Click subscribe now, and we'll see you next time.